So what we did essentially, there's respondent rights, if you will, what the respondent can expect. So this is something that needs to be put in front of the respondents. And then there's also the researcher responsibilities. So there's researcher responsibilities, that's what we need, the guidelines, as well as something that we can put in front of our respondents. So the reason that we do this is we want to keep the trust, we want to keep them in sharing their information with us. So the question for you, gentlemen, is this. The respondent of the future, in particular with mobile, in particular with all these new wearable devices, where do you see this going as far as digital identities? We talked about earlier, we heard about that. Where do you see this going as far as law in Europe and privacy? I'll toss it up for you first.
Thank you very much. I'll take the difficult one first, I think. I think first we would say that certainly data protection or privacy isn't a barrier to doing anything. It's not an excuse not to do something, but instead put in place those set of controls, to help protect that data that you protect, the collecting from the data subjects or the individuals. And certainly that's, clearly more important in the mobile world. Everyone's probably there's probably more than, 2 devices per person in this room at the moment, collecting a multitude of data going on, processing that in the background. So it's really understanding, so making sure that the users are there in control, they know what's going on, and those sort of key areas of transparency, so people know what's there. Can they control that data that's being collected about them? And I think that's certainly something that will only ever increase in sort of the need, that those users do want data. They want to know what's about them. You can see from the stories that might have been in the media, and people are saying, oh, it's tracking me, it's creepy, they want to know, they want to be in control and stop those things that are happening. So I think that's where, and certainly recognise there are differences in culture, across Europe, even differences in culture within the UK. Probably even people change their views on a daily basis on what they think about privacy or data protection, whether that be because where they are or what they're doing or which organisation they're interacting with. So we're going to see, those rules or regulations, if you want to call them that, will get stronger, will get stricter, but only in terms of putting those users back in control of their own data.
I have because of our role in trying to defend the market research industry and keep the door open for us to approach anybody we think would be useful and helpful in providing us with information, we have to try and persuade the legislators that we are not an advertising activity, that people who do not want to be tracked by advertisers are still at liberty to talk to researchers, and that if they activate, for example, a do not track button on their browser, we should still be able to count them and ask them if they would like to take part in a survey. The difficulty we have in Europe is that the OBA, the behavioral advertising industry, took a very aggressive stance against privacy a couple of years ago and has created an atmosphere where it's been very difficult to rebuild trust in people who are working honestly. And one of the difficulties for legislators is that they run a long way behind the technology. So at the moment, the debate in Europe is all about what you're going to be allowed to do with advertising and whether research is a, quotes, scientific activity, which gives us a lot of exemptions in terms of our abilities to hold data and to approach people. What we've tried to do with the mobile guidelines is get this industry ahead of the curve so that when the legislators start to look at how they might deal with mobile, we will already have some very good practices in our industry. You may have read the story in the Sunday Times about the fact that Ipsos was collecting identities of people who were using their mobiles and offering to sell them to the police. So, dealing with that kind of issue is really quite a problem for us. But our objective is to make sure that as our industry moves on to mobile platforms, that the legislation works with us. And the big issue for us, and that's why I was very interested to hear from Mick Kennedy this morning, is the digital identity, because there needs to be a way to help people control who has access to their personal information. So I think that's a really good development, and I hope they come to an agreement.
Yeah, adding to that, picking up on Alan's point about being ahead of the curve, I think it's important to remember that for a long time research has been ahead of the curve. The Data Protection Act that we have is from 1998. The first Data Protection Act is from 1984. MRS has had a code of conduct since 1954. You've had a ESOMAR from 1948. And in those codes of conduct, you will find the ideas of informed consent, of involuntary participation, of transparency, and protecting the individual. And this is the cornerstone on which research is built and the heritage that we're building from. And in many respects, it was the law that caught up with our position. And so I think sometimes we get a lot of flack, particularly when I talk to researchers who might be on the more cutting edge. So I think, oh, well, these ideas of voluntary participation, it's very old hat, isn't it? There's simply all this information out there, and can't we just go and get it? And you have to go back and reinforce this idea, and remind them what their legal obligations are, of course, that this is about user control. This is about people choosing to be involved, choosing to give us their information. And that's something that our guidelines are really, really important in maintaining and in framing the way that this whole industry looks forward. I mean, I think in regard to what's happening in Europe, in many ways, this is, myself and Adam have been working on this particular project since about 2009. The vast amounts of our lives been spent talking to these people. And in a way, a lot of the issues that are being discussed are framed around the internet 4 years ago. And it's about, Facebook, this is a problem because, people might put things they regret up and we have to do something about this. And the technology has moved so much further in between. And the way that data protection has moved, and particularly in this country, data protection is a rather unfortunate phrase. It tends to be treated in the same way as health and safety. It's an excuse not to do something rather than an actual way of protecting people. But data protection has gone from being about information in a machine, and this is when data protection rules were written. A computer was something approximately the size of a wardrobe. It had lots of flashing lights on it and things that went round and round. And so it was what goes in that machine and how can we restrict its use, to a point where essentially our entire lives are transitioning into the digital realm. And it's a completely different way of thinking, of a completely different set of assumptions about what information goes in and why. But the same principles underpin that about control and about transparency, about consent. And it's really important to remember that.
So the commercialization of privacy. When you think about this, I was just talking with some folks earlier today. You're now seeing companies that are in play to act as a liaison, if you will, with research agencies and the individuals. Handshake.com is a new service I just was reading about a moment ago. Google it, Handshake. Exists to basically help commoditize privacy. And it's all going towards a digital identity, right? So if we hold this up and say, okay, you can follow me here at an arm's length, right, versus the individual, what are your thoughts about these kinds of services now coming into play, and how does that interact with our ability to gain insights into who's the real behind the hand?
Well, I think certainly examples like Handshake are, again, putting that user back in control and saying, yes, you can market, target, research in these particular areas when I'm willing. And obviously that will only ever improve the results that come back. But I guess the opposite of that is people find a negative example of market research and think, right, I'm going to throw all the shutters up and you're not going to know anything about me absolutely ever. So I guess there's the opposite, which we can try and combat.
I think one of the problems that we've seen with ad blockers is that they all have different protocols, and nobody could agree what the standard was. So as a result, things were getting knocked out because they were on an ad blocking list. Particularly research companies were getting knocked out because they were on an ad blocking list. And it is a full-time occupation trying to deal with multiple different organizations, all of whom do it differently. And similarly, these trust brands and intermediaries are potentially a huge problem for us because they're there to make money, and yet they are offering different things to different classes of consumer. So one of the really important things, that was again what Mick Kennedy was good on, is if the telcos can come up with an agreed international standard for allowing people to express their choice, then I think there is an opportunity for people to pick up that standard and for us as an industry to engage with it rather than letting shall we say, the brand of privacy being owned by a diverse group of people that nobody really knows and trusts.
Yeah, there's also a sort of general philosophical issue here about what kind of rights we're talking about, because in the US predominantly it's a consumer protection issue, and that's how it's seen, that people shouldn't be misled, they shouldn't be harmed, they should incur adverse consequences by parting with their data. On the European side, we've got the idea of data protection as being a fundamental right. It's up there with your right to life and your right to party, presumably, and it's integral to your humanity, this idea of informational self-determination. What these intermediaries are doing are introducing a third set, and they're dealing with this as a property right. That data, your identity is something to be bought and sold. It's a bundle of rights like copyright, which you can then license to people and withdraw those licenses. And so the extent to which these like Handshake.com fits in within the current legal framework for recognizing these things is, I put a question mark beside it, but yes, I would see them in the long term creating a problem in terms of being a gatekeeper.
I think if there is a standard for managing your digital identity, what you'll see moving into that is trusted brands. So you will get in the UK John Lewis or Waitrose, possibly Tesco. Google is already in that space as a trusted brand for an awful lot of people who give them personal data. And I would see the intermediaries as going out if there is a standard. If there's no standard, of course, they will capture that market.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about, we as researchers, of course, we're all under the same guidelines. We operate in the same sandbox. We know the rules. What's happening outside the sandbox, and how do you think that we as researchers should be interacting with those other agencies that are also engaged now in interacting with consumers and hearing their voice and opinions?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a role, as I said, we come from a long heritage of doing this, and we have a role as ambassadors to go out and to explain, particularly to clients, about the nature of privacy, what it means to have trust. I mean, one of the things that MRS has been pioneering the last year or so is a trust mark called Fair Data, and it's been taken up by a number of our member companies, but also by companies outside of that sector, as a way of demonstrating to the public generally, that you are someone who adheres to not only the basic principles of the law, but a more complete set of principles about the way in which you will use and hold and share, perhaps, personal data. And it is built on transparency. And I think that's something that as a sector we can make a story about, and it's something that we can promote to other organizations and to other agencies.
Do you think they want to hear it?
I think they do. I think this whole debate around privacy is actually about trust. And you can't legislate for trust, which is kind of what the European Commission is trying to do. But its trust is something that is earned. And without that trust, you may in the short term be able to get and hold personal data, but you won't be able to maintain it.
I think, as we've seen in certain online services, people do trust them. People do hand over, a lot of personal data because, they're aware of the controls or the protections around those. And, as a responsible group, you've got, a good code of conduct there. Promote that to those individuals and say, we are the trusted brand. Come to us and use that as a sort of product differentiator, which certain other services are using at the moment. They're saying, we are the safest place for your data. We won't use it for selling on to third parties, or we will only use it for these specific purposes. So that's certainly a good line to be promoting.
I think that if you look at the way that our industry has grown, we've always used the interview transaction as an opportunity to explain to people what professional research looks like. And that has helped us maintain a certain status. As we've moved into online interview, we've kind of lost that. And I think with mobile and with the fact that you're carrying this very personal device with you, if we're going to get people to cooperate, we are going to have to sell ourselves quite effectively. And there is a great benefit in us cooperating with each other to build research and what research looks like as a trusted brand. The other thing I would say is underlying this conversation is, of course, the issue about big data and the extraction of an awful lot of the information that we need for research purposes from the device you're carrying. So there needs to be a higher level of trust than perhaps there was when you just gave an interview and edited what you said to the interviewer. You're going to need to trust people to have access to your diary, to your contacts, to your phone calls, a great amount of data. So there is a real benefit in us as an industry getting together, unlike the advertising industry, and telling a very good and coordinated story about what we do.
You know, the advent of newer technologies coming into play now. We're going to see Google Glass later today. When you start thinking about always-on cameras that you're wearing, always-on monitoring of immediate environmental things and biometrics that are 24 hours a day with us. How do we actually think about this as a research body, as an organization, as an industry, to help people keep those lights on, but at the same time protecting them when you're walking around videotaping everything in your world?
I was reading something in a newspaper a couple of weeks ago with an early adopter of Google Glass writing about that and saying that some people found it very sinister that they were carrying a device which was taking pictures, or might have been taking pictures as they were talking to them. So I think, as with all new technology, there will be a period of socialization. You know, there will be maybe, you know, how when a camera is working, quite often it has a red light on it if you're so you know which camera to look at in the studio. Maybe Google will find that in order to reassure people that when it's recording, it has a red light on it. That's the kind of thing I could see being engineered into the system to make it more socially acceptable.
You know, and when you think about this in a broader sense as well, like in mystery shopping, I mean, there have been hidden videos for a long time in play in the U.S. at least, and I'm not sure what's happened in Europe with that. In the
Well, if you read, I think it's Rule B44 of the MRS Code of Conduct. I spend my life answering queries on this, but if you haven't guessed. Well, it's based on a fairly low form of implied consent, particularly where employees are involved, where employees would be expected to have been informed and would have agreed that their performance would have been monitored in some way by mystery shopping. And if essentially that's not possible to achieve, then no, you can't engage in secret recording.
Right.
You can't do it for competitor brands, for example, where the opportunity isn't there to inform the staff. That would be, you know, essentially it would be go very old school mystery shopping. Go in, remember as much as you can, come out, write the report, but don't process any personal data in the way you do it.
And when you actually come down to do that on a video, right, as a researcher, if it's always on and it's immediate, think about that now. We're actually able to get into the eyes of our respondents and walk around with them virtually. How does that happen under the law?
This is where you start getting into the emerging law that's being developed. So this issue about at what point do you anonymize data? In the past, virtually all market research data was collected with consent. Because it was an interview, your decision to answer the questions was taken as implied consent. And you would have been informed about the process by the interviewer. When you are collecting information with a video camera, there isn't necessarily any consent involved. And the same issue comes up when you're tracking people on the internet. If you're collecting hits on content on the internet, you may be counting people who haven't consented to accept the cookie or the beacon. So we're moving to a space where the law is still trying to decide what will be permissible in terms of whether the terms and conditions of the site you're using will tell you that you might be counted, whether the Market Research Society trust mark will tell you that actually there is a site on either somebody with a counter on this site. But the key issue here is that what we have done always with where there was consent is to say to people, you will be anonymous unless you give your consent not to be. So in that respect, you need to anonymize any video or image that you're showing which has people who have not consented to be shown in public or to your client. If you take the same approach when you're doing research, where you're doing ethnography, you're picking up information. As you collect it, you should try and get consent. If you haven't got consent, you should really not be letting any of that information outside your organization without having either got consent or anonymizing the individuals, and you should destroy it as soon as you have finished working with it.
I want to open it up for discussion. Any questions, any thoughts from the audience about this topic? Oh, Ray, of course.
Just very quickly, what about third parties? Adam, you said that with the Android phone, you've got to be careful. I can give you permission to look at my phone, but it's got a lot of photos of other people, including children, friends of my own children. It's got Facebook details of other people. It's got contact details of other people. Can I give you permission to access their data?
You can give me permission to hold the data which you hold, but I can't use that data without their consent, if that makes sense, or without you having got consent for me to use it. In other words, if I inadvertently collect it, I can't use it, but I should try in the first instance not to collect it.
If you sit down and you read the report that they've produced, it's fascinating in the sort of the levels of detail and the controls, and where they're pointing out, well, actually, all this is fine, you could do more of this, you need to provide more information with that. And there's something in there that we can all learn about understanding how this environment works, and the law that we've got at the moment, how that interacts with this very fastly, rapidly changing area.
I would just say, in those kind of scenarios, you would certainly need to look at, well, what was the purpose, and why did that person, your friend on Facebook, post that information? And what is your purpose for collecting your information? And clearly in the example you've given, there's a clear disjoint in those two purposes. So we need to look very carefully about why that processing is going on.
Quick question for you. Adam and Barry, you were talking earlier about researchers being able to retain the privileges that are afforded to us, separating us from marketing. And I wondered what your thoughts were on, has that boat already left the harbour, and are researchers already being thrown into the bucket of marketeers?
No, not at all. Absolutely not. I think, one of the things that ICO's been working on the last year is this whole rise of nuisance calls, for example. There's a massive spate of nuisance phone calls, particularly in regard to PPI, consumer lifestyle questionnaires, where people they're doing a survey, but actually if you answer the questions, they'll be sold to people who then market you further. And we've been able to have very clear conversations with the ICO, with DCMS, with Ofcom, and be able to clearly delineate between what researchers do and what marketers do. The fact that TPS and FPS and all the all the rules that come from the Privacy and Electronic Communication regulations relate to direct marketing. They do not relate to market research. So we certainly in the UK and under the umbrella of MRS, we've been able to make a very, very clear distinction. Now, of course, we require our members to play ball and follow the rules, but in terms of the way our code is framed and the way that research is defined and understood both by us and by the regulators, we've been able to make that distinction very, very clear. Now, in regard to Europe, that's something we have to maintain in the legislation that's coming forward, and that's what we spend a lot of time. I have Article 83 of the draft regulation etched onto my brain in its various permutations. Some of them I like, some of them I less so, and so that's the sort of repeated conversations that we have with regulators and legislators.
And just to follow up on what happens in Europe, because European directives are enacted locally into law, there is considerable variability at the moment across law about how things like this will be treated. As a whole, I've said, market research gets protections. It's quite interesting that there are countries like Italy where you might be surprised to know that they have stricter laws than Germany when it comes to dealing with data. The difficulty is knowing when they're going to enforce them. The new regulation that's going through could maintain those protections for market research, but equally it could not. And the debate about that is evolving, and as it's going on very, very slowly, so the technology keeps changing, and things like PRISM happen, and so it's quite difficult to predict how it would come out. But at the moment, I think we're reasonably confident the market research is at least getting a fair hearing.
As market research companies, do you feel it's more important to better the name of the industry market research, or to keep a good image of the company itself as an individual?
So the question is it better for the industry to have this protections, or is it more up to the company, individual?
As regards to the image of the company itself.
As regards to the image of the company itself?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
just repeating,
I
Francis.
think that there are, I mean, I'm in danger of saying yes to both questions, but there is a real benefit, because we're quite a small industry relative to, say, the advertising industry or the big retail groups. There is a real benefit in us as an industry holding together to represent what we do as professional market research and branding that. Equally, there is no doubt that there are some research companies that are very visible in the public eye, and it would be very good that they maintained a good image, and certainly we don't want any market research companies getting a bad reputation, because it will reflect on all of us. But I think as an industry, we have a lot to gain by standing together.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the league table that MRS produces every year for the UK, only about 20 research companies are not small or medium-sized enterprises. So there's a few big brands, but then there's a very long tail. There's hundreds of companies that are often only 10 or 20 people. And really, you know, it's fine for GfK and Ipsos and Kantar or whoever to have a well-known, well-respected brand, but most companies don't have that yet. They maybe aspire to do so. But but certainly having worked for MRS for 8 years and dealt with members of the public and their complaints, the British population has a very clear and a very accurate understanding of what market research is. And I think people know market research, they're happy to participate, they don't like marketing so much. And so I think maintaining that brand for the sector is really, really important, because, you know, there is brand equity there already. So let's keep it and hold on to it.
And just to add to that, as you go out across Europe, market research translated into other languages doesn't sound so good in some languages. And so we tend to talk about market, social, and opinion research, because the social and opinion research, which are big pieces of work in the governmental space, actually convey to people that idea that this is a continuum of activity. It's not somehow just a commercial business marketing operation.
I mean, from a regulator's perspective, if a complaint came in about a particular market research company, it was one of these, you know, smaller companies. You know, if they could come around and very quickly say to us, well, you know, we follow this code of conduct. We've signed up to this self-regulatory scheme. You know, that's certainly going to help us close that case a little bit quicker. Of course, we will, you know, ask for, you know, checks of compliance to make sure that they are following that code of conduct. But it will certainly help us, you know, focus on the particular problem areas in the industry.
11 of the Data Protection Act, and you've got companies, and I'm going to name names such as Opt-out UK. The reason for my concern is that this business is offering to block not just marketing, direct marketing sales, but also market research. And, you know, they've got no legal authority to do that. They're actually misleading consumers. So my question for the panel is really the proliferation of call blocking, marketing blocking services, and there's a whole page on it in terms on the telephone preference service site. Is it a minor irritation? Is it a real cause for concern? And how do we respond as an industry?
Okay, I'll take a general view of this. Sitting out in Santa Clara on the West Coast is the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C for short. They have a group running which is having weekly meetings, which is trying to resolve what would happen on your browser when you press Do Not Track, DNT for short. And we have been involved as ESOMAR in the discussions, and we have agreed with them that there will be a protocol for people who are members of a panel which is signed up with consent to do market research, that when you activate DNT, it won't knock you out. In the early stages of the discussion, 2 years ago, there was a discussion about whether they would pick up these blocking operations and agree a protocol which would make it possible for us as an industry and others to have a standardized protocol which would operate. And it was regarded as too difficult. So at the moment, there is no way of controlling these firms, and they can do what they like, which is a huge problem for us, and it's something we would very much like to deal with, but we rely on people like W3C to try and get an agreement. And as I say, they failed and are now leaving it alone for the moment.
Okay, your question relates to a couple of issues I've touched on already, but Section 11 is interesting because the section is specifically about opting out from your personal details being processed for direct marketing. So it's a very good example of in terms of the question that Guy asked, that this is one of the really good reasons for maintaining the distinction between market research and marketing, is that there are very particular rules that apply to marketing that do not apply to market research. And so where a research company gets a request in regard to Section 11 saying, I do not want my data to be processed for direct marketing, fine, great, we're not going to process for direct marketing. That's not what you do, it's not your business model. I think the rise of these companies is a direct response to this problem in regard to nuisance calls, and that outside operators and a number of companies in the UK, sort of people who are involved in lists, building lists and selling lists, involved in creating. And so I think that's a response to a demand. So what we have to do is turn off that demand, and that's one of the things that we've been working with Ofcom, with DCMS, with ICO, and the ICO's fined. Last three fines of total £700,000 or something in regard
somewhere around there.
Something like that. So there is quite an aggressive program that we support, where we get information about companies involved in these calls. We feed it through to the ICO to sort of try and close that loop. The other thing to note, I suppose, of these companies, the Opt-out UK or whatever they call themselves, is they are not really acting in the interests of the consumer, because often they are charging for services that are free. So you will pay a fee to this opt-out company, and then they will register you with the TPS. Well, that's a free service. You can do that, TPS. The idea that they are acting to protect individuals is, I would put a very large question mark. To a certain extent, they are slightly parasitic, and they've seen a business opportunity in this general problem. And so our role is to try and narrow the window for them to act in that role.
We're slightly over time, but I want Ben, last question up there.
Thanks, Mark. You kind of half answered my question already. I was going to follow on from this one, which is the blend between marketing and market research. And I call it the survey monkey effect, where marketers, until the recent past, had a one-way dialogue conversation with their consumers, and as market researchers, were the ones having the two-way dialogue. And now marketers are having that two-way dialogue almost unedited. And how far are we trying to distance ourselves from the survey monkey effect versus actually trying to get involved and help those marketers that may not be so educated, help them understand our codes of conduct and help them understand what they shouldn't be doing with platforms that are out there like SurveyMonkey?
I think there are two different issues there. One is, should people who don't understand how to ask a question or how to use the answers they're getting back be using that for decision support? And my view about that is we really do have to promote effectively what we as an industry offer, but people have a free choice, and if that's what they want to do, they can do it. The other part of that is to do with whether they are complying with the law. And I think increasingly companies' compliance departments will need to look at the extent to which the activities of these people are reasonable. But I agree, there's a big grey space where you can buy panel data from sample from a reasonable sample supplier, and you can use SurveyMonkey, and essentially I don't think anybody can stop you doing that. All we can do is to build the brand of professional research and make sure that that's well publicised.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've looked at, and if you look at our code of conduct, often it talks about our members' professional activities rather than research per se. Because we've had to make the distinction between a technique, such as a questionnaire or a survey, and the purpose for which that data is then going to be used. And so, like these lifestyle questionnaires, you can go out with a clipboard and you can ask people all these questions. That doesn't make it research. The idea is, what are you then going to use it for? And I think, yes, in regards to compliance, I think I think some data protection departments or some data protection would have nightmares if they knew what their marketing departments were doing with things like SurveyMonkey. It's like, you're what now? What? Really? We're taking that data, and where is that data being stored? You've no idea. Okay, good. And so I think it's a compliance issue, and as companies become aware of the risks, that will begin to close again. There's one of these things where technology becomes available, everyone piles in and sees what it does, and then the lawyers step in and shut it down. But one of the things what we try and do is to say, this is what research is, this is what marketing is. Marketing is a perfectly legitimate activity. However, it comes with a set of rules and obligations that you need to understand. And just because you're using a questionnaire, don't think that you're doing market research. And this is why we have codes and we have guidelines. We try and speak to different audiences about these different things.